50,000 numbers or even maybe a million numbers or something like that. Now when I feed those million numbers to fx to this function, the output y equal to fx is again distributed from here to here, whatever is the output distribution. Now all these numbers within this strip dx, now we assume that it is now lying within this strip dy here after I pass these numbers dn through this shaping function. So it is now here. So the dn is equal to, here it will be n naught py dy, which is the area under this strip. Now the same number of numbers, if there are 50 numbers within this strip, the same 50 numbers are actually mapped here. So this dn is same on both sides, which means n naught dx should be equal to n naught py dy. Okay, which means dx is equal to py dy. Got it? Which means dx by dy, which is inverse of the f prime x, because y is equal to fx, so dx dy is basically 1 by f prime x. F prime x means the derivative. So 1 by f prime x is equal to the probability distribution py. Also, since y is equal to fx, we know that x is equal to f inverse y. Now if I take the derivative on both sides, I get 1 is equal to f inverse y prime, that means the derivative of f inverse y with respect to y, multiplied by dy dx, which is f prime x. Dy dx is f prime x, here you can see. Got it? But f prime x is inverse of py. So if I substitute it there using both this equation and this equation, we find that we have a condition that the derivative of the inverse function f inverse is equal to the probability density py. And it turns out that there is no guarantee that for every arbitrary probability density py you are going to find such a function f which will be satisfying this condition, this criteria. So you cannot use this particular scheme for any arbitrary distribution. Only some certain distributions are available for which this technique can be used. Fortunately, this technique can be used for normally distributed numbers. You know the meaning of the normalized Gaussian distribution or the normal probability density Px. It is given in terms of 1 by square root of 2 pi e to the power minus x square by 2. Here the variance is 1 and the mean is 0. So it is the well-known normal distribution. And in many streams of or in many domains of engineering and science, this is encountered again and again. We often see this normal distribution in nature. The reason probably lies in the fact that that central limit theorem can be responsible for that. That why in nature we commonly keep seeing this kind of the normal distribution in various cases. Now, unfortunately, for this particular value of px that we have here, so that means this particular shape that I want here looking like this, you cannot directly find the value fy or fx analytically. It is not possible. So there is a small trick behind this. The trick is that we are not going to generate one but two Gaussian distributed numbers simultaneously. So we are going to generate not the numbers not one by one but in pairs. So we are going to generate 2 numbers, then 4 numbers, then 6 numbers, like that. In pairs they will be generated. So suppose with the same probability density I am generating 2 independent numbers x and y. Then the joint probability density will be px multiplied by py, that is equal to 1 by 2 pi e to the power minus x square plus y square by 2. Now we can immediately see that this expression x square plus y square, it indicates some kind of a symmetry. We can realize it further when we convert it into the polar coordinates. So suppose x is given by r cos theta, y is given by r sin theta. So instead of the values x and y, I am thinking in terms of r and theta. And when we do that, we have pxy is equal to, it is converted to pr theta, and x square plus y square is r square. So it becomes 1 by 2 pi e to the power minus r square by 2. So what it basically says that only radial dependency is there with respect to distance. So if I randomly generate the point xy, so to generate a random point xy, we have to generate the coordinates x and y independently, and we are assuming that x and y are independently following the normal probability density. So when we generate it, we find that only a radial dependence is there. So if you are closer to the center, the numbers are more and more frequent, the points are more and more frequent, the density is large. If we move away from the center, the density is small. But it only depends upon the distance from the center, not the angle which that point is making with respect to the x or y axis. Which means that the net probability that r is less than some outer value capital R. So if I choose some outer value r, and the probability that this point, any particular randomly chosen point, is within the outer circle of radius r, is simply obtained by integrating this one from 0 to r, and theta, since there is no dependence on theta, so theta is integrated from 0 to 2 pi. And the result is simple, it is 1 minus c to the power minus r square by 2. R is the outer radius, the radius which we are using as a cutoff radius. So the probability that a random point is within that radius is this. Now let us assume that I am using this notation g as a function of r to represent this probability where r is less than r. So it is of course a function of r, this thing. So I am calling it gr. Now you can see that when r tends to 0, then gr tends to 0. You can see that, because then it will be 1 minus 1, 0. And when r tends to infinity, then this becomes 1 minus 0, so it becomes 1. So it is quite interesting that when we are varying 0, I mean the value of r from 0 to infinity, gr is only varying from 0 to 1. So it is a very interesting kind of scaling. And remember that the uniform random number generator is only varying from 0 to 1. I mean the values generated by that kind of a generator, that only varies from 0 to 1. So let us suppose that this gr is basically sampling the values taken from a uniform random number generator, a simple uniform random number generator, because then we know that it is only varying from 0 to 1. So if that is the case, then we can say that gr 1 minus c to the power minus r square by 2 is some kind of a uniform random number, which I can write it as 1 minus u1. There is no problem in writing that, because since any random number u1 is varying from 0 to 1 only, assuming that u1 is given by a uniform random number generator, a standard uniform random number generator. So since it is varying from 0 to 1 only, so 1 minus u1 is also varying from 0 to 1, isn't it? So I can always write this 1 minus this thing is equal to 1 minus u1. And it is satisfying the condition that it is always from 0 to 1. And if that is the case, then I can obtain r in the form of square root of minus 2 log u1. So 1 and 1 is cancelled on both sides. I have to take logarithm on both sides, I get this result. But that is only r, it is not complete, because r, the distance from the center, is a combination of x and y. So I am just getting the value of r. Theta is also required, the angle it makes from the x-axis. Now it turns out that it is not a problem, because the probability density is independent of theta. So whatever is the value of theta, it is independent of theta. All the values of theta are equally likely. So theta can be anything from 0 to 2 pi with equal probability. So what we can do is that we can choose theta as 2 pi u2. u2 is another random number varying from 0 to 1. So that u2 is varying from 0 to 1 and theta will be varying from 0 to 2 pi. So theta is uniformly distributed in 0 to 2 pi. So in this way we are getting a combination of r and theta, and then we can convert it back to the x and y value as x equal to r cos theta, y is equal to r sin theta. This way we can generate a pair of random numbers, and this will be uniformly distributed. This will be normally distributed using the normal Gaussian distribution. Okay. So let us just take one more simple example, or I should say that let us take a simple demonstration of this one. So here I have written another program. This is for generating normally distributed random numbers. Okay. The format is similar to the previous one, the modulo pseudo random number generator. The first value is the length. What is the length that we want? The seed value, okay, the value of the mu, the value of sigma. Mu and sigma are basically the mean and the standard deviation. So once we can generate a standard normal distribution, we can always scale those values using offset values and multiplications to get any arbitrary standard deviation and any arbitrary mean. So let us see here. So first of all, I am just making a simple provision to ensure that if the length that you want is an odd number, then we will add 1 to it to make it even number, because we can only generate the numbers in pairs. Okay. So that was the scheme, if you recall, that we have to generate two numbers, u1 and u2 simultaneously, and using u1 and u2 we will generate x and y. So that is the idea. So two numbers are generated simultaneously, x and y. So suppose you want 6 numbers, there is no problem, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But suppose you want 7 numbers, random numbers, then I have to generate one extra. We have to make it 8. And then if required, we can discard the last one. So let us see here. So what we are doing here is that we are setting the A, C and M values, because we have seen that we need to generate the numbers u1 and u2. So this number u1 and u2 is generated, or it is used first, and these are regular random numbers from 0 to 1 and uniformly distributed. So that we can generate using the modulo generator that we have just written. And since we are going to call the modulo generator, so I am giving these values of the parameters A, C and M. Then these values u1 and u2 are generated. I am not going into the details there. The exact details of the program's flow is not important, but we are generating these two numbers u1 and u2 using the simple pseudo random number generator which we just have seen. So we are getting the values u1, u2. Then we are calculating the value of theta is 2 pi u1, r is square root of minus 2 log u2. We have just seen the formula. Then the value of x is r cos theta, y is r sin theta. Okay, we are generating x and y, and then we can combine these two arrays x and y. And in case the the total number of values that we were requiring is odd number, then we can just remove the last value from the array. This is just the extra ornamental work that we are doing. And finally, this x value is just a stream of random numbers. So I multiply both the numbers by the value of sigma. So sigma is the standard deviation, how broad or how narrow the distribution will be. And the value of mu will be added to that. So it will give me the offset. So that is the basic idea. And it is just the implementation of this scheme which we have just discussed. It is known as the Box-Muller method or the Box-Muller transform, it is also called. So let us see the demonstration here. So we are just going to call this number. So I am writing x is equal to this function. Now suppose again I want 10,000 values. Any arbitrary seed I can provide. Now the value of mu, let us suppose it is 1. Okay, and the value of sigma is 0. So it is centered at the middle, x equal to 0, it is centered at that. Okay, so I am generating it. Then we can see how the noise looks like. Sorry, what is happening here? Wait, let me, some problem is there. So I am generating 10,000 values. I don't know if the seed is not good enough. Let us choose something else. Let us choose some arbitrary value. Sigma and sorry, I made a mistake. Mu is not 1. The value of mu is basically 0. Sigma is the standard deviation. I'm sorry. And then when we plot it, you can see how the noise looks like. The first thing that we note here is that it is no more confined in the range of 0 to 1, as was the case for the regular uniform random number generator, because it is Gaussian distribution. Gaussian distribution does not have a finite range. It is ideally from minus infinity to plus infinity. So you can have some values which are very small, you can have some values which are very large. Okay, and when we see the histogram with, let us say, 25 beans, in the previous case we saw that it was a flat histogram. Now here you can see that it is a normal distribution or the Gaussian distribution. It is centered at 0. It is centered at 0, and the values, I mean the standard deviation is 1. Okay. So this is how we generate the Gaussian distributed random number. Any question here? Any query? Okay, so we can continue further. Just for your information, I am going to show you that these are not the only type of random number generators which are possible. These are algorithmic random number generators that I have shown you. Algorithmic random number generators are not truly random. They use some kind of algorithm to generate the numbers. It looks more or less random to us. Maybe for most of the practical purposes they are also sufficient. But sometimes the quality of the random numbers are very much important. They should be of very high quality. There are some kind of computing in science and engineering where we need very good quality randomness. Now, when that kind of a situation is there, then we have to go to the hardware random number generators. Hardware random number generator means they actually do some kind of a measurement in nature to generate the random numbers, not using some algorithm. It is a true random number, an actual random number. Now, various types of hardware random number generators are possible. Some of them are, which I am showing here, so some of them are based upon the Johnson noise. Johnson noise is basically the thermal noise in resistors. So in any conducting material or anywhere some kind of resistance is there, so some kind of thermal noise is present there. So that thermal noise can be measured using an electronic circuit. You can amplify it, and the result can be a source of random number generator, or it can be a source of the random number stream, I should say. Another source is Zener noise. In Zener diode, a lot of noise is present. So Zener diode is, one second. Hello? Oh, sorry. Sorry. So in the case of a Zener diode, there is a Zener noise. Okay, it is a reverse bias diode. So this noise can also be measured, and it can be used as a source of random numbers. Radioactive decay is possible. When you have a radioisotope nucleus, we don't exactly know at which moment it is going to decay, or maybe it can, let us say, emit an alpha particle or something. So a detector can detect the decay of a radioactive nucleus, which happens randomly, and then it can use the result to generate, some kind of random numbers. Atmospheric noise is also possible to be used as a source of random numbers, because atmospheric noise is the result of, it is a kind of radio noise. So since there are always thunder and clouds, so always some kind of radio, some kind of radio wave generation is there in the atmosphere all the time, and that is noisy. So that can be picked up using a radio, and that can be used as a source of random numbers. Then there is also something which is called a stochastic diffusive memory state. It is actually mimicked, not exactly created. So that is also used as a source of randomness. This is an example of a true random number generator. So this is available on Amazon. So you can see that it looks like a pen drive. You can plug it into your USB, and it will generate stream of random numbers. So these things are actually available in the market. So there are situations where you cannot compromise on the quality of the random numbers that you want for your simulations. And in those situations, we have to use this kind of hardware random number generators. Similarly, there is a website which is called random.org. You can go to the website. This website supplies two random numbers. So they have some kind of a setup which picks up atmospheric noise, and using that noise, they create and record the random numbers. So it is available on their server. You can download those random numbers from this website. There is also this Hotbit server, which is also generating the random numbers. I think Hotbits is based upon some kind of radioactive decay detector. So it can detect the decay of a radioactive nucleus, and using that it can generate random bits. So these are the facilities which are available for true random number generators if it turns out that you are not satisfied with the algorithmic process of random number generation. Now, one very important aspect of random numbers, or basically I should say that the utilization of the random numbers is related to the so-called Monte Carlo calculations. Monte Carlo calculation means where you are using random numbers or some kind of randomness to compute some property of a system. And the heart of the Monte Carlo integration is what we call the Monte Carlo integration. For any Monte Carlo computation, the major portion lies in the so-called Monte Carlo integration. The idea is simple. Suppose I want to integrate a function, so fx, and it is varying from a to b. So of course, if it is, we can handle it, in an analytical way, that is the best situation. But suppose the function is such that we cannot actually integrate it in an analytical manner. We have to, go towards what we call the numerical integration. We have to find the value numerically. So how do we do that? Now, the basic idea that we often do in the conventional method is this, or this is, there are several techniques for simple numerical integration, but they are all based upon this fundamental idea. So the fundamental idea is that this whole range A to B, we have to split into n number of equal intervals. Okay, and then we in each interval, or in each sub-interval, in each of those n sub-intervals, we take the midpoint of that sub-interval, I call it xi, and then I evaluate the function at that midpoint value f of xi, and then we do it for each of the sub-interval between a to b, and then we add all of them, summation over all of this, and finally we multiply it by b minus a by n, which is basically the size of a particular interval. So b minus a by n is you can say that it is a numerical approximation of the infinitesimal dx, and this summation is basically the approximation of the integral. So that is the basic idea, but this is not equal, it is close to, because there is always some error which is involved here. And how much error is present in this case? It can be shown that the error is of the order of 1 by n, which is quite good. So if the number of subintervals is larger, the error decreases rapidly. 1 by n is, it is going down very sharply. This is the amount of error, 1 by n. So it means more and more divisions are there from A to B, in between A to B. We are splitting it, the whole range, into much finer grid, and the better approximation we get because the error is reduced. No problem here. However, the same procedure can be used for, let us say, two-dimensional integral also. That means I can do a surface integration. Some kind of a closed surface is given to me. I know the domain. And over that finite domain, I want to calculate a function fx as fxy. The same technique is available here. I have to split the entire surface into many small subdomains, and in each subdomain, all of them are similar. So maybe they are rectangular, or maybe they are square subdomains within the whole range. And then at midpoint of that, of each subdomain, we are calculating the value of the function, we are adding those values, and then multiplying it by a by n. In this case, b minus a is the length from a to b, because it is a one-dimensional, so it is a length. In two-dimensional, a is the area of this subdomain, is the area of this two-dimensional domain. So it becomes a by n, total area. Here it is total length by n, here it is area by n. And what is the error in this case? In the previous case, it was 1 by n, the order of 1 by n. In this case, it turns out that the error is of the order of 1 by n to the power minus half. That is 1 by square root of n. Now 1 by square root of n decays much slower than 1 by n. So that means it is not giving you better results simply by increasing the number of domains, simply by increasing the number of subdomains, because this is the problem. It will become better, but you need too many intervals. I mean, you need too many subdomains within the whole domain S to get the equivalent amount of error, because it is decaying very slowly. And this continues. If I go to a volume integral, I can do this as volume divided by the number of domains in which I am splitting the volume, and it will turn out that the error is even poorer. Here it is n to the power minus 1 by 3, that is 1 by cube root of n. It is decaying much slowly as compared to this also. And this continues for n dimension. If I do an n dimensional integration, the error varies as n to the power minus 1 by d. So it is giving us a lot of error. So this method is not usable. Maybe fine for the one-dimensional integration, may be tolerable for the two-dimensional integration, but beyond it, it cannot be used satisfactorily. So we have to, reject this idea for arbitrary integration in arbitrary dimensions. Another possible technique is there, which is known as the Monte Carlo integration. That is what I am going to discuss here. That technique says that you use the exact same formula what is written here. The only difference with respect to the conventional integration is that you don't split the domain into regular intervals. Instead, you fill the domain by n number of randomly chosen points. So in one dimension, it basically says that between A and B, you pick up n number of random points in that interval A to B. Randomly you choose n number of points. That we have already seen, that is something that we can do using a random number generator. So I am picking up those n number of points randomly, then we add it and then use the same formula. Similarly, in two-dimension integration, in the two-dimensional domain, within the two-dimensional domain, we are picking up random number of n number of random points and then we are adding them by after evaluating the value of the function at all those points. Similarly, in three dimension, the whole volume, within the volume we are picking up points randomly, then calculating the value of the function, adding them and then multiplying them by v by n. V is the volume of the domain on which we are integrating. And of course, we can extend it to higher dimensions also. The advantage here is that in this case, the order of error is fixed at 1 by square root n for all the dimensions, irrespective of whether it is a line integration or a surface integral, basically I should say, or a area integration or a volume integral, whatever we do, with respect to n, the order always converges or the order always decays as 1 by square root n. Which means when I am considering one-dimensional integration, this method is actually worse, because in the one-dimensional integration in the conventional method, it was n to the power minus 1. The error was decaying much rapidly. For two-dimensional integration, it is same as the conventional method. It is n to the power minus half in both the cases. And from higher order onwards, this becomes better, because n to the power minus half is better than n to the power minus 3 or n to the power minus 4 or whatever. So these are the reasons why we go for Monte Carlo integration. Got it? A very simple demonstration I can perhaps show you. The simple demonstration is like this. Suppose an area is given to me. It is a circle and I want to calculate the area of the circle. I know the radius of the circle, maybe pi r square, but I don't know, the radius r is given to me, but I am not aware of the formula of the area. I just want to figure out what it is. So how do we do that? Now, first let us see how can we do that in an intuitive manner. So suppose this circle is inscribed in a square. So if r is the radius, then the side of the square is of length 2r. Okay. Now what I do is that I fill this whole region by random points. So the whole square, inside the square I am generating random points. Okay. It is uniformly distributed, or I should say that the density of the point should be homogeneous everywhere. Now some of the points are inside the circle, some of the points are outside the circle. Then what we do is that we calculate or we count how many points are inside the circle. Okay. So we can understand even intuitively that suppose the area of the circle is A0 and the area of the whole square is this A square, which I have written here, then the ratio A0 by A square is equal to, it should be equal to how many points are inside the circle, n divided by the total number of points n dot. Okay, you can understand it even intuitively that this is what is going to happen, provided every point is uniformly is generated uniformly without any bias towards its coordinate, which means the circle A0, the area of the circle, can be calculated as n in by n dot multiplied by area of the square. Area of the square that we know, it is 4r square multiplied by total number of points inside the circle divided by the total number of points that we are generating. So just by counting how many points are inside the circle, we can calculate its area. That is one way of solving the Monte Carlo integration problem. Now you may ask that why is it a Monte Carlo integration? Monte Carlo integration is this one, which I just showed you. That for a two-dimensional region, this is what the Monte Carlo integration says. But we are not doing it like that. We are just taking the ratio. So we can actually see that this procedure is equivalent to solving a Monte Carlo integration, because if you notice that that calculation of the area is basically a double integral. Area is double integral of dx dy. So let us see how it works. So suppose I say that I am defining a function fxy such that fxy is equal to 1 when the point xy is inside the circle, and when it is outside the circle this function is 0. Okay, which means if I calculate fxy for all the points here, then it is equal to 1 plus 1 plus 1 if I do the summation, because it is 1 whenever it is inside the circle. So this 1 plus 1 plus 1 will happen n number of times, that is how many points are inside the circle, plus it will be 0 when it is outside the circle. So 0 plus 0 plus 0, how many times it is outside the circle. That is equal to simply n in. Okay. Now see here, A naught, that is the A circle, that is the area of the circle, is simply integral of dx dy within the domain of the circle. That is equal to double integral of fxy dxy within the outer domain of the whole square. Why? Because the outer domain of the square is consisting of the inner portion, that is the circle, plus outside the circle region. And outside the circle region fxy is already 0, and inside the circle it is simply 1. So writing this dx dy is equal to writing this one, because it is equal to double integral of dx dy, isn't it? Because outside the circle it is simply 0, so it doesn't count, which is equal to now this thing in the overall outer range. That means for the square, that turns out to be the area, which is a square, in this case the area of the square, divided by n. N is the total number of points which we are generating, and this summation of fxy, yi, this we have seen that it is equal to n. So when I substitute it here, this turns out to be n in by n dot multiplied by a naught, which is same as written here, that we saw intuitively. So it turns out that this scheme that we are using is nothing but some kind of Monte Carlo integration that we are doing here. Got it? So it is basically indirectly this integration. Any question up to this point? Okay. Then we can continue further, I think. So one demonstration I will show that is related to the simulation of diffusion phenomenon. You know what is diffusion. So material scientists know about it, chemists know about it, chemical engineers know about it, physicists know about it, and they use it again and again. Diffusion means when some substance is present in very high concentration at one point, then if we leave it on its own, the substance, it diffuses in the outward direction. It moves away from the initial position, and with passage of time the thing spreads out. So for example, when we put a drop of ink in water, so diffusion takes place. It gradually spreads out. Now why should it spread out? Of course, if I take some kind of a charge, let us suppose if I take a bunch of electrons together, they will have a tendency to spread out because they will repel each other. The electrons are Coulombic repulsors. So one electron which is having a negative charge is going to repel another electron which is having a negative charge. So if I take, let us say, a dozen electrons at one point, if we squeeze them in a narrow region, and when we release it, then it is going to diffuse. I mean, not diffuse, then the electrons are going to move away from each other. But that is not diffusion, that is drift. Because in the case of this ink drop in water, there is no repulsion between the molecules of the ink. They don't actually see each other. So how does the diffusion take place? Why should the particles go away from each other? So physics has an answer to that. So physics says that it happens because of random walk. Random walk means a particle need not care what other particles are doing. If it has a lot of space around it, it can just hop from one point to another point randomly. And if it keeps on doing, and if all the particles are moving independently in a random manner, then it turns out that diffusion will take place. So that is as simple as that. There is no driving force for diffusion as such. So let us consider a one-dimensional diffusion problem. One-dimensional diffusion comes from a one-dimensional random walk. So suppose I have one point here, a particle which is present here. At any point of time, I start from this position, I call it the position as the zero position. This is +1, this is +2, +3, and on the left the positions are -1, -2, -3 and so on. So at any point, let us suppose in every iteration, this point can either go towards the right direction or it can go towards left, okay, with equal probability, let us say. And this can continue. So at any point of time, if the point is at any particular position, then the particle can move towards right or towards its left, independent of its previous moves, and with equal probability it can go anywhere. Okay. So suppose in the next step it is coming here, then in the next step it is coming here, then in the next step it is going back, because with equal probability it can go anywhere. Now suppose the same experiment you are doing simultaneously. So multiple people are doing the same experiment. In each case the point is starting from the same position, here, here, here. But they are moving to different positions according to what is the probability. So it is like throwing a toss, tossing a coin. So you can toss a coin. If it is head, you are moving to right. If it is tail, you are moving to left. So everyone who is sitting with this coin, so every person is doing his or her own experiment by tossing the coin. And so even though the initial position is same, the final position at any particular time is not going to be same. So suppose at any particular instant of time I am taking a snapshot of this board. So the first point is here, the second point is here, the third point is here. So the points are at different positions. Okay. Now this is basically what diffusion means. You can see that they are spreading out. They don't have to, this point does not have to care what this point is doing, but it is automatically spreading out. Okay. And suppose we are measuring how it is spreading out. Suppose I ask that what is the mean position, the average of that position. So intuitively you can understand that the mean position still remains 0. Why? Because during any particular step, with equal probability it is going to left, or with equal probability it is going to right. So if I have a large number of such points, maybe a billion such points, with equal probability it is going to left or right at any particular step. So the mean bit value, the mean position will remain at 0. However, the mean, even though the mean position remains at 0, it is spreading out. We can see that it is spreading out. So what is increasing? So it turns out that what is increasing is basically the mean square value, the mean square displacement. So if I take the position at any particular time t as xt, and if I take the difference from the mean x bar, and if I take the square of that magnitude, and if I take the expectation value means means of all those points. Because multiple such points are doing this, so if we are taking the mean, the average of all those positions, and if we calculate that, then it turns out that it is proportional to the time t, time or the iteration number, whatever you say. And this proportionality is called 2D, where D is nothing but the diffusivity that we find in Fick's law of diffusion. And mathematically it can be shown that this simple random walk model can give rise to the Fick's law of diffusion. And if I do an experiment using random numbers, if I do a simulation, then I can always calculate this mean square displacement, and I can fit a slope with respect to time. If I plot this value with respect to time, it should be a linear line. It should be a line, and the slope of the line should give me 2D. So D is half of that slope. Got it? So I will just show you a simple demonstration here. Again, there is no need to bother about the details of the programming language. Just it is sufficient if you focus on the idea what is happening here. So this is the random walk calculation. So I am giving some parameters here, which is the parameter of step size. Step size means in one iteration, what is the step size? So 1 means it is either going +1 or -1. N step, it basically represents how many steps I am computing. So I am computing up to 4,500, so 4,500 time steps. And N particle, that means how many parallel experiments are running. So how many such particles are there? This is N particle. And step means what is the maximum value of T I am taking. That is N step here. So the particle is basically, I am writing here 10,000 particles I am taking. Then I am initializing the random number generator with its seed A, C and M. I am using the same random number generator which I just demonstrated here. And we are doing it here. So the time is varying from 0 to N step -1. We don't have to bother about that. What is important is that the sum position, which is the array which is going to contain the sum of the positions in each time step. So this position plus this position plus this position plus this position. So sum of this position at each time step, because if I do the sum and if I divide it by the total number of particles, that will give me the mean position x bar, this one. Got it? So this is why we are getting this thing. And then also we are calculating the sum of the square displacement. This is again an array which will calculate the square displacement, because that will be required in our work. So I am starting the iteration here for 1 to the total number of particles here is in a for loop. So for each particle I am now running the iteration. Now at any particular step, what we are doing is that we are calculating the direction. The direction is either +1 or -1. So in this particular line, I am calculating the direction. So the random number which is generated, which is varying from 0 to 1, but the direction is either -1 or +1. So what we are doing, I am doing here is that I am subtracting from those random numbers the value of 0.5. So if the random numbers are varying from 0 to 1, so if I subtract 0.5 from all of them, so you can see that all the numbers will eventually vary from -0.5 to +0.5. And half of them will be negative, half of them will be positive. So I am just taking the sign of those values. So half of them will be -1, half of them, roughly half of them should be +1. So I am randomly generating the direction. And then I am updating the positions according to the direction. Then I am calculating the sum and the square of that. And then I am finally plotting those values here. Okay. So I am plotting with respect to time the value of the root mean square displacement. So this value, basically this value, then I am plotting. So this whole thing at different time steps, this whole thing, this expectation value, I am plotting with respect to time. If everything is done correctly, and if the statistical analysis is correct, as it can be shown mathematically, then it should give me a straight line, and I should be able to fit to it. Sorry. Then when I am doing the fitting, I can finally do a fit. Here I am doing the fitting with respect to a straight line, and the value of the fit will give us the diffusivity. The diffusivity, there is a mistake here, I should divide it by 2. Whatever the fitting coefficient is there, that should be divided by 2. So when I run it, I will just show you the run. It will take some time. Now it is done. So here you can see that when I am calculating the root mean squared deviation, the root mean squared deviation is basically the square root of this one, the root mean squared deviation that we call the RMS value. So the root mean square value should be proportional to square root t. So it is a root t type of a root t kind of a plot, which you can see it here. So the root mean square value which I am plotting here, it is varying as 1 by square root of t kind of a relation is there. And if I take the square of the y-axis, which is the mean square, not the root mean square, but the mean square, then we basically get this result. And you can see that it is exactly a straight line as predicted mathematically. In any simple textbook of statistics or statistical physics, in the very beginning you will find this derivation, that random walk generates a linear relation with respect to time when you compute the mean square deviation. And this red line is the actual fitted line. It is a straight line fitting, the red line that you see here. And this blue background, this blue line is basically the computed root mean square value. So when we do the linear fitting, we can get the diffusivity, and the diffusivity value, which you can see here, I have written here, is whatever is the value, it is written it as 0.493725. Then we know that whenever the temperature is high, the diffusivity increases. That also we can simulate. How? It is very simple. Here, right at this point of time, what is happening is that a particle can move to left or to right with equal probability. You can add the effect of temperature in a way that it can move to left or it can move to right. That is possible, but it won't always happen. It will happen with a finite probability. Whether it will move at all, it will depend upon the temperature. If the temperature is large, it will move. If there is an energy barrier, let us say Q, then the probability that this jump will happen is e to the power minus Q by kT. K is the Boltzmann constant, we know that. So we can modify this program slightly to actually consider the effect of temperature also. So here I have added two more things, which is the value of dE, which is the energy barrier, which I set it as 0.5, and the value of kT, which is 0.1. So e to the power minus dE by kT should be the probability with respect to temperature, that what will be the diffusivity there. I mean, it should be the probability, it should dictate whether the jump will occur at all or not. So I am not going into the details of the program here, that is not necessary, but here you can see that in line 29, I am comparing whether a random value is larger or smaller than the transition probability. Got it? And the transition probability is given here. You can see here I have written e to the power minus dE by kT. So with a given transition probability, the jump will happen or it won't happen. It will stay in the same position. So with a finite transition probability, in the previous case the jump was always happening. Whether it is right or towards left, that is a different issue, but the jump will always happen. Here the jump may happen or it may not happen, depending upon what is the temperature and what is the energy barrier. That happens in any activated process. So in physics or in chemistry or in engineering, we know that this is how any activated process works. Okay. So you can see here that suppose I now run this program. Let me clear it. I run it again. Let us hold for some time. And it is again a straight line, we can fit it to that. And here you can see that the diffusivity is written as 0.0032 something. Okay, it is 0.0032 something. So let us assume that this value is a very low temperature. I am doubling the temperature. So I am making KT as 0.2. The temperature is now becoming double. Again run the same program and see how the temperature affects the diffusivity. Just hold on for a few seconds. Here you can see that it is, since the temperature is high, it is a little bit rigid kind of a result you are getting, but still we can do a fitting more or less. And here you can see that the diffusivity now is 0.038 something. Earlier it was 0.0032. So it is more than 10 times increase in the diffusivity the moment I am doubling the temperature. So this gives a very nice demonstration why we say that at higher temperature the diffusivity increases, because the diffusivity is the result of random walk of a particle, and the moment we put an energy barrier, then you can see that at higher temperature the probability of crossing the energy barrier, it increases, which results into better diffusivity. So that's all. I will just stop it here. So these are some of the ideas that how a digital stochasticity, that means the generation of randomness in a computer and its application in scientific computing, it comes into picture. So there are many types of scientific computation, whether it is in physics, in chemistry, whether it is in chemical engineering, in mechanical engineering, in all sorts of fields. Whenever we do some kind of technical computation, the randomness are required in several kinds of computations, and these are the methods of introducing randomness to the system, and also I have demonstrated some of the applications of doing that. So with that I will just say thank you. Thanks for listening. I am open to any question that you may have.
Thank you so much for nice talk. Now, Modhuri by some person, I am allowing your microphone. Please, you can ask the question, and also camera. I am allowing. So please ask question. Mothura by _v@VNR. I have allowed your microphone. Please ask question. Mathura Bhai?
Sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, my camera, I can't switch it on.
No
It's
need
from
to
the
switch on the
fine.
camera. Microphone
Sure.
is fine.
Sir, it was a nice session, sir. My question is, like, using Monte Carlo integration, can we set the interval which is from 0 to infinity into a range something like 0 to 1?
See, what happens is that the whatever interval the integral is asking. So suppose the integral is asking, say, a to b, then the Monte Carlo integration, when you are doing the summation over the randomly chosen points, that should follow the exact same the interval a to b. So if the original interval is, so let us say, some value to infinity or whatever, then there is a problem, because in that case it is very much difficult to actually, do the integration over an infinite interval. However, one possibility is that depending upon what kind of problem you are tackling, it is possible that the original integration that you are trying to solve, that can be rescaled or it can be remapped to a different integral where the other integral is within a finite range. It is possible to do that. So for example, I am giving you an example. So suppose I am doing some kind of integration x, okay. Now that integration is varying from, let us say, 0 to infinity, okay. Now if I change the scale of x and I say that there is something which is y, and y is defined as y is equal to tan inverse x, then we know that since x is varying from 0 to infinity, y, which is tan inverse of x, it will only vary from 0 to pi by 2. Got it? So by change of variables, the original integral, which is over an infinite range, you can convert it into a finite range integral, and then you can easily solve it using the Monte Carlo integration. So depending upon which problem you are solving, you have to choose a way to do that.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess one more question is there.
Sir, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Sir, I have a small query regarding technical information. Whatever the explanation you have provided, it is being given in the MATLAB, right, sir?
Can you come again? I did not.
It is given in MATLAB, right?
The demonstration which I gave,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
I did
yes.
it on MATLAB, but you can do it on any other language.
Yes, sir. I have a small query, sir, because if I am an expert in Python scripting language, using NumPy, I am able to do this, sir.
See, if you, I was just actually giving you a demonstration of how those things are done. In practice, when you are going to use something like NumPy, you won't actually write a program to generate the random numbers, because NumPy has its own function which will give you the random.
Built-in functions are there, sir.
So that portion where I was just showing how the random numbers are generated, that is just to give you an idea how NumPy or these programs work internally.
Okay, that you mean the actual business logic you
what
have.
is happening under the hood. Actually, even for MATLAB, I am not sure about NumPy. Even for MATLAB, the techniques which I showed, that is not actually used. In MATLAB, more advanced techniques for random number generation is used. By default, the MATLAB's random number generator is something known as a Mersenne twister.
Correct, sir.
So which, if I am not wrong. So that those are more advanced methods. This is an ongoing field of research, how to get better and better algorithms for generating random numbers. So when you are actually doing it in practice, you will just pick up some kind of a ready-made library for or some ready-made function
I can make use and I can implement, I can proceed further.
Yeah. But the subsequent thing which I demonstrated, like the Monte Carlo integration or the demonstration for diffusion, those things you can get as soon as you get the random numbers that you can implement in any language.
Sir, I have one more query, sir, because basically the proficiency what I am having is related to computer programming. Of course, I have applied for this particular session pertaining to the metallurgy, and then how this is going to help me in a future, sir, because basically I'm an expert in programming. I know the mainframes programming as well as Python programming. Right now, I am in the role of assistant professor for a freshman engineering department.
Yes.
How these sessions are going to help professionals like us, sir?
I did not actually get your stream properly. Which stream you said you are from? Which
sir, right now I have been in the role of assistant professor, especially to teach Python and the C programming languages to engineering students.
But do you have any particular, technical domain in which you want to implement this? Any particular engineering domain? It could be material science.
No, I don't have any specific idea. If at all, if I know Python well, you mean to say if I scale my programming skills from 1 to 5, out of which my rating is a 5, then whether is it going to help me these sessions?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Why not?
Okay.
So, whatever engineering application is there, so whatever methods you will learn here, actually it is very good because you will get some idea about what kind of computation is done in actual engineering practice. So when you are learning any kind of a programming language from the perspective of a computer scientist, there are two types of things. First is the conventional computer science thing, where you are teaching some student, let us say, like how to do quick sort algorithm. That is a different kind of a domain. Another domain is the scientific computing. Scientific computing has its own set of challenges, its own difficulties. Here you have to suppose focus on how the floating point number is represented in my computer.
Correct.
Because different strategies are there, whether it is IEEE 754 kind of floating point representation, whether it is a big endian representation, whether it is a little endian representation. So those things start becoming an important aspect. Because in scientific computing, the basic is that you have to do a lot of number crunching, huge number crunching. So it has its own challenges. So maybe you can get some idea about what kind of algorithms are required. We are basically dealing with numerical algorithms.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so which are important in this kind of.
Yes, sir. Understood, sir. Understood. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody else to ask question? Want to ask question? Please raise your hand. Anybody else? Ask any doubts, anything? Okay, once again, thank you, Professor Amlan Muttu. Thank you again for.
Thank you, Professor Pal, for inviting
your
me.
precious time. Okay, thanks a lot. And
thank you very much.
All the participants, I am telling that all the participants, please see the WhatsApp group. There will be the link for next session. Or already you have got those link in your email ID.